Deltas have long played an important role in human history. These fertile areas where rivers flow into large bodies of water have served as fishing, farming, and living sites for human and wildlife. This river is a lifeline here, and it meanders down to these plains before joining the Indian Ocean at Kipini. The Tana is Kenya's longest river, with its source being the Mount Kenya and the Aberdare Range in Central Region.
Wapokomo ni watu ambao wanakaa kando kando ya mto.
Naitwa Wasanye, Langulo, ni Waboni, Wadahalo, ni majina zetu tu. Lakini jina yetu asilia ni Wapa.
Sisi ni wafugaji kwa jumla. At the same time tunalima shamba ndogo ndogo. Lakini tegemeo yetu ni ufugaji na tunategemea delta.
Imekuwa hali ngumu ya maisha. Na ile hali ngumu ililetwa na hawa watu wa kulima wa hii shamba hii.
Mwaka wa 90 hali ya maji pia ilikuwa punguani tena. Na hapo sasa ndipo hii athari ya chumvi kuingia katika mashamba ikawa kubwa zaidi.
Sasa hebu angalia hii msitu, hii forest. Alikuwa maisha yake hakuna mtu ameingia ndani, lakini maji imekosa maji, miti zote ya asili sasa inaanza kukauka.
Life in the Tana Delta is now changing, and some areas here have now been turned into killing fields.
Ng'ombe nakufa.
Tulikuwa tunaishi vizuri, samaki, ukiangalia hii area hii yote hii ilikuwa inaingia maji na tulikuwa tunapata riziki huku, wazee walikuwa hawahangaiki. Lakini siku hizi inakuwa maisha ni magumu. Kwa sababu area ambayo tulikuwa tunaitegemea kwa ukulima na kuingia maji na kupata riziki zetu, saa hizi zimekatizwa zote, maji yanapelekwa kwa msitu na yanapelekwa kwa mtoni.
There is no doubt that environmental degradation and poor strategic management have seriously threatened the delta. As if that is not enough, various organizations and individuals are forcing themselves into the area to reap the remaining riches. All of a sudden, communities are finding themselves sandwiched between unfriendly neighbors.
Tumevamiwa. Pande ya jua la kutoka tumenyanganywa na settlement scheme. Na hii settlement scheme haki ilikuwa ni sisi wenyewe tupatiwe, alafu wageni wapatiwe. Lakini sasa 80% imepatiwa wageni ya kutoka nje. Na sisi wale wakaji ya hapa hakuna kitu tumepata.
Tana Delta tumechoka yoyo kunyanyaswa, tunawachek hao.
Local and international companies have lined up numerous multi-million ventures that are to be implemented in this area. These include oilseed farming, sugarcane plantations, crops for biofuels, mining and exploration for oil and gas. The Tana Delta has also attracted researchers. Under the National Museums of Kenya, KenWeb, Kenya Wetlands Biodiversity Research Initiative, was established due to the high demand for knowledge on wetlands in East Africa.
This is Carissa.
These experts have now developed an assessment methodology to provide accurate and quick-time valuation of wetland resources, ecosystem values, and user strategies. Members of the KenWeb team are drawn from the National Museums of Kenya, the French Institute of Research for Development, Kenya Wildlife Services, and the University of Nairobi.
We decided to put this team together to enable us to put efforts to have a multidisciplinary team. Rather than each person going out, for example, a fish expert going just fishing and working on the analysis alone, that would go out as a team of all taxa groups in terms of biodiversity and experts in floods and limnology, hydrobiology. We even have people working on social economic issues.
The particular program I'm in charge is for the emergence of new research teams.
and the KenWeb project was selected in 2010.
We are a group of scientists from diverse backgrounds in expertise and in origin working together, which, believe it or not, is a very new thing in 2011.
Because when you have, it's all extremely flat.
We are a team of French and Kenyan researchers, and we started to work in the Tana Delta in 2008 with a project called Geopar. It's when we realized that water was a very important issue in the Tana Delta, that we wanted to understand how much water was in the system and what would be the best flood scenarios for the ecosystems and for the users. But then, while working, some large-scale irrigation projects started to happen, and it was really essential for us to also take that into account. So we developed a second project called PACTER, which is looking at the impact specifically of this large-scale irrigation project. But we also developed another part of the study, which is about biodiversity in a third project now called KenWeb.
It's an important bird area, and at the moment, Kenya Wildlife Service is steering the process of designating the Tana Delta as a Ramsar site. And being a Ramsar site basically means that it's a globally recognized site because of its biodiversity importance, because of its cultural importance, because of the social-economic potential that the Tana Delta has.
I joined KenWeb to provide botanical expertise on the areas that KenWeb is going to be working in. My previous work examining the botany of coastal Kenya, in fact the whole of East Africa, has been very useful in providing a background database for looking at the species of the delta and providing an inventory of plants in the area.
Endani ukude jange munapata mpawa, endani na chamado munapata mamba, shomani nsui mupate visembe, shomani nsui mupate visembe.
River deltas are known for being fragile and dynamic, and any small changes made to the hydrological systems will upset the already delicate balance and in turn wreak havoc on the ecosystem.
Here we are at Kaluta, and this water is ocean water. It's about 2 or 3 times as salty as the ocean. There's not enough water in the delta to do the tidal rice cultivation. So in order to keep as much water in the river as possible, the people downstream have closed off this Kaluta branch. But what happens when there's no more fresh water coming into this branch is that the ocean at each high tide, and especially at the equinox in March and September, the ocean comes further and further in. There is no coordination of the management in the Tana Delta.
Over the last 50 years, Kenyan wetlands have experienced major changes due to global warming, land use changes, large agricultural irrigation schemes located in the upper catchments, and species introductions. The effects have led to the loss of livelihoods for communities that depend on resources from such lands downstream.
Maji nyingi sana yanachukuliwa huko majuu, huko unakuja maji kidogo ambao hata hii samaki haipati makao ya kuzaa mzuri kwa sababu hakuna maji.
Maisha ni magumu na kama hivyo chakula kwetu ni shida.
Maji samaki inatakana izae kwa matuka. Sasa hiyo maji inakuja ni kidogo sana ambao hata hiyo maji haifiki kwa ile matuka.
All the young stages of shrimp and crabs, prawns, all the small fish that make the coastal fishery of Kenya so rich, they spend time here. They feed here, they grow here, they have an essential life stage in the mangrove systems. And here in the Tana, there's only about 4,000–5,000 hectares of mangrove left. So it is really, really a vital ecosystem. And that is why enough fresh water has to come down from the upstream to keep this system alive.
Maisha yamekuwa magumu Mchana mzima unaweza ukashinda kutafuta samaki, ukapata samaki watatu.
There's a big floodplain there, meaning that since it floods periodically, no one builds there. So this has created a perception, a wrong perception, that this is unused land.
The delta appears to be empty.
That there are no people there. That this land is available for anything we want to do with it.
But that's not true. When we go in there as scientists, we see the dynamics that exist there. You see a land that seems to be at rest, but no, actually right there in that piece of land is a resource for pastures during the dry season.
This land is very important because it is a counter-seasonal grazing area. So livestock that can come all the way from Garissa and all around, even from Voi.
Some come from as far as Wajir, that's like 200 something kilometers away. So this area is very important to people in a very wide, far beyond its geographical limits.
The little brown birds are about 2,000 Madagascar pratincoles. They have just arrived from the breeding grounds in Madagascar, and this is a threatened species. The world population is estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 birds. So if there's 2,000 here, at least 20%, 1/5 of the world population of the Madagascar pratincole spends the Madagascar winter here. So say between April until October, thousands of these birds find refuge in the Tana Delta.
When you go there, you see water, and you might think, no one's using this water.
And even more, there's also competition for water at a river basin scale, because upstream some dams have been constructed, and the flood has been disrupted. There used to be a peak flood, a flood peak in May, but since the construction of the dams, it has been reduced by 20%.
The team has installed equipment to monitor water levels along the river and a number of weather stations around the delta.
Flooding has such a negative sense in many situations, but mainly the problem of flooding is for infrastructure, while in wetlands, in coastal wetlands, the way the people are cultivating is very adapted to the flooding.
For them, the flood is a normal occurrence. They have lived and adapted to it for centuries. But when we look at it from an outsider view, we see trouble.
You can see G1 is there, one. So after every 16 days, I must come and cut grass.
That is actually what we want to try to quantify, to see for a flooding scenario how much grass is actually going to be produced in the floodplain grasslands, and compare it to a non-flooding scenario and see how much grass is going to be produced during that time. So then we'll be able to compare what happens when there's a flood and what happens when there's not a flood. So we'll be able to say which is better.
Here we are in perhaps the least known and the most valuable ecosystem of the Tana Delta. This forest is part of one of the 34 biodiversity hotspots on the planet.
To understand the botany of the Tana Delta, one has to put it in context of the East African coast and specifically the Kenyan coast. We were able to list over 3,400 species. Now, the Tana Delta is sort of a wedge in this area. We now have a list of some 670 species. Many of them are common species that you find ranging all over East Africa. Others are more specific to the Tana Delta.
One must imagine that of the Eastern African coastal forest that used to cover the whole coastal belt, less than 1% remains in its original state.
A lot of the grassland species are much more common. They're found throughout East Africa, but here in the Tana they make up a very important community, and with the continued flooding of the plain, support a huge number of mammals and birds.
There are two species of primate, the Tana red colobus and the Tana mangabe, that only occur in those thin strips of riverine forest around the Tana River.
What we want to do now is to measure. We are going to use is a oxygen meter. So whenever we measure the amount of dissolved oxygen, we also measure the water temperature. 30.5 degrees centigrade. That is relatively warm water. And the oxygen concentration is quite good.
Shomaninsui, upate visembe, shomaninsui, upate visembe, shomaninsui, upate.
After the photo, we take a piece of tissue for genetic studies in the lab.
Shomaninsui, upate visembe.
Kama hujapitia wakaji hapa, hujauliza maswali ama hujauliza shida yake, ile research yako kuna kitu imebaki.
Such forums are held mainly to gather, share information, and most importantly, learn from the indigenous people about traditional knowledge that in most cases is oral.
Every time as a researcher, when you go out to do research, you should have an open mind. And an open mind is that there's a lot of indigenous knowledge that is already existing wherever you're doing your research.
We've had to drop the method where we would be going to the field to do science for the sake of science. Because in a lot of our areas, we've discovered that the people there know a lot more than we do.
Na hapa ni nyeupe. Kuna ingine inakaa kama hii.
So as a team of researchers in KenWeb, we go out there knowing that there's already existing indigenous knowledge. So we interact with the communities, we ask them what knowledge do they have about the Delta. And actually what we've experienced is that they have a lot of knowledge regarding the way the Delta used to be, the flooding regime, and how the flooding regime has changed, the biodiversity status, the way it was, and now how it has changed.
So far we have 5 students in the KenWeb. These are students who have come in with the various partners and now will be mentored by the group. For us, students are important because not only do we get a chance to mentor them to take up what we are doing, but also we are able to work through them because a student can do so much more than a researcher who is elsewhere full-time.
Shida yetu ni maji tu.
Namna ambao serikali wamefikiria na sisi tuishi namna ile ya panda ile, sisi hatuwezi kuishi namna hiyo.
Ngombe, maisha ni ngombe, kuna maisha mengine.
Kutoka ukauke mto huu, njaa imezidi, imebidi mtu kulima apate chakula, lime na mashini, huna uwezo wa mashini, wewe ni kukaa. Ungojereshe ni ya serikali.
Angeli tugawia hiyo shamba, tupate kila moja shamba yake, mtu ajisaidie nayo.
Sisi tu anze kulima na kisha wao wenyewe wanunue, tupate faida na sisi na wao wapate faida kwao.
Mashamba yetu nyingi wamechukua. Saa hii watoto wetu tunazaa, sijui wataenda kulima wapi.
Na huwa wanatunyanyasa. Hawatulipi vile inatakana. Na sisi tunafanya hiyo kazi kwa kutafuta chakula ya watoto.
Tunataka hii title deed ijulikane ni kwamba ni haki ya wafugaji na hii wanyama wa pori, na isiwe na miradi yote bila wananchi kuhusishwa iletwe.
KenWeb does not have answers to all these concerns, but wishes to facilitate in finding solutions to most of them. Being on the ground, this team of local and international researchers is trying to build knowledge about the Tana Delta and eventually share its findings with policymakers, civil and private organizations, and most importantly, its inhabitants.
Kusifungwe tena mto tena kusiweke madamu mengine.
Kwa hivyo kama wanataka kunyang'anya sisi hii delta, watuletee delta ingine sisi na viboko yetu na wanyama yetu na ng'ombe yetu, tuhame kwa hiyo delta ingine.
Sisi ya mtu wa Kenya au ya mtu ya gani? Mtu wa ile na Germany.
We don't provide the answer. We provide the material to think about the future.
Where we are at right now, we have been able to build a very, very good relationship with the communities we work with. And so far, when we go out there, they recognize us and they understand why we're there. It has taken a long time to build up that trust, and it will take as much effort to maintain it.
Conservation is not an animal problem, it's a human problem. So if you study conservation without reference to human dimensions, you are fast moving towards irrelevance.
This is a very good example of what can happen if we don't have a proper management of the water in the dams and if we do not do flood releases.
In this system of the Tana River, there are obvious conflict situations or potential conflict situations. Trying things on a small scale can help people to really do more with less water. So it's about doing science, responding to the questions raised, the issues raised by the communities, and feeding that information back to them. And of course also to the decision makers, because if decisions at the highest level are taken against reliable scientific knowledge, we know that the delta will disappear. And it has happened in so many other places before.
Sui, shomanin sui, upate visembe, shomanin sui, shomanin sui, upate visembe, shomanin sui, shomanin sui. Upate visembe, endani ukule jange, munapata mpawa, endani na chamadho, munapata mamba, endani ukule jange, munapata mpawa, endani na chamadho, munapata mamba, endani shakababo, munapata mamba, shomanin sui, shomanin sui. Mupate visembe, shomanin sui, shomanin sui. Mupate visembe, shomanin sui, shomanin sui. Mupate visembe.